very important. So I'm third year here, third year PhD student. I'm submitting in January for my Viva. I come from Israel originally. I did BA in art design and media. That was 4-year day study in Israel. And the PhD here is about art practice. My interest is the process of creativity in art. So I'm definitely not interested in the final product, that is to say the final painting, for example, but I'm interested in the process in which the artists come to produce a painting. What I'm looking at is the so-called stages of inspiration, how artists are inspired. And this is very abstract and quite difficult subject indeed. Why to do it in art? I'm making art practice, and out of the art I produce the knowledge. I don't want to produce another theoretical investigation, another book that will make a theory about it, made by a non-artist, and that will remain a book. I want to make art, and out of the making to try to understand what is that process of creativity. Now, as Kandinsky said, in the last 100 years in the study of the Western art, the art in the Western society, we've been following what we call deconstruction. That is, we're taking things and we do not try to represent them in art, but we try to deconstruct them to their shapes. That's an example. You all know abstract art. This is a cow, and then we try to deconstruct it to the shape of the cow, triangle. And then we're taking it further, and we try to see what are the minimal shapes in the history of art that make reality. You all know Picasso, and how he takes element with his cubism, and he deconstructs it. And of course, Mondrian even go further. He doesn't deconstruct space. You don't see space here, but you see only shapes. The shape and the color create the space, the fore and the back. So this process of deconstruction is what we're following for the last 100 years in the Western society. And of course, it began much earlier. This is El Greco, 17th century. Could be considered as one of the first modern abstract art with all the geometrical shapes. So it's not something which is recent, but in recent time, I think we're going away completely from the description of natural reality to shapes and color. Now, what I'm trying to do the reverse process. I'm trying to go back in a way. Instead of deconstruct, I'm trying to reconstruct. I'm trying to unite words, images, and senses to make them one thing. Which is why in my research I'm making films, I'm creating short films, short verse poetry that I'm writing, I'm producing graphic design, performances, and installations. I'm trying to take all the elements and make one thing. Because in order to understand the higher complex of the process of creativity, I think it's quite natural to reconstruct it and see how it works together. So the process of inspiration is what I'm interested in. The first film that I made as part of the PhD called Quantum Worlds, it was a film about trying to show that process of inspiration. I don't have time today to show you all the films, they're all on YouTube. Quantum World was an experiment to visualize the process of inspiration. And what I've noticed is that people usually see the result. They will see the table in front of you, and from the table they will try to understand the reality. They will not try to observe the process in which this table was created. So when I first began, I noticed that there is a kind of contradiction following that idea of the process of creativity. The contradiction is that the artist sees something outside, as we all see, but he also has inner feeling at the same time, which doesn't correspond to what he sees. If you like, the eye of the artist observes a flower, but inside him he feels something else, which is much larger than the flower. This is a contradiction which I observed follow the work of artists. So I went to science, so to speak. My first year of my PhD was what I call the scientific quest. I've studied a bit, read a bit quantum physics. I spoke to many scientists in this country. I attended conferences about science and art. As an art student, I cannot argue for any scientific understanding, but I can argue that I understand what they talk about. And indeed, quantum physics shows us that there is a contradiction in reality. According to quantum physics, the theory of quantum physics, you can observe an electron as a particle from one point of view, and then if you look at the same electron at the same time from a different point of view, you will see that it behaves as a wave. That is, the same electron at the same place at the same time behaving in a contradictory way. which was very instrumental in my process of this PhD, because it corresponds to the process of contradiction of artists. But the problem that it really doesn't tell about the artist's own experience inside. It tells you what's going outside, which is fine, but it doesn't tell you what's going within the artist. What is going within the artist is what interests me. And I made another film called Unfolding Heart. That was actually the third film, Unfolding Heart, which I would also present to the Viva, which tell about the process, the contradiction, the process of condition that artists feel, what happened inside of them. So I continue and I drew to psychology, mainly to Carl Jung, which indeed tell you about a so-called parallel reality. So if quantum physics tell you about contradiction in the external reality, psychology will try to argue for an inner reality, something which resides within the artist, the so-called collective unconsciousness, which was very helpful because then I could situate the external and the internal. The next process that I went through in this PhD is to interview artists. So at first I've interviewed poets, about 6-7 poets, and all interviews you can read on my website, because the PhD began with the investigation of the Romantic poets. In the last year and a half I also began to interview visual artists, because it is based in visual artists school. And from the interview of artists, I noted that they all talk about 99% of hard work and 1% of inspiration. So my interest is that 1%, which is the inspiration. But when you ask them what is that inspiration and how this process goes, they all tell you, I don't know. They all say, I basically do not know. And one recurring word which I've noticed in the interview is the word mystery. They all tell you it's mystery, it's mysterious. How inspiration works for me, what is the collective unconsciousness, how I get an idea, that is mysterious. I can't really tell. I also made another interview, and for that interview I decided to do something a bit different. I decided to go to that mysterious source itself, and I decided to interview my own muse, my own source of creativity. And I made a film which some of you know, called Interview with Author Yourself. You can watch it on YouTube, where an artist asks his own muse question. And this is a real interview, which I later on made into a film, where I asked my own muse, I asked him, how do I create poetry? Why do you inspire to write poetry? Who are you? And how does this process unfold, this process of creativity? So from the interview that I made with other artists, and from that interview of the so-called my own muse, which follow deep meditation, trance mediumship, I've learned that there are a few steps that I can look into in the way that artists work, in the way that the process of the creativity with artists work. The first thing that I've noticed is that artists simply stop. They suspend, they let their minds suspend from pre-assumption, from assumption that we all have. They do not accept it, they stop. And then they simply experience contradiction. So the artist can see here a beautiful flower, and at the same time he can feel inside of him what Abraham Maslow called peak experience, what I call collective unconsciousness, source of creativity. There is a contradiction. Artists see a flower, as we all see, but he can feel something much larger. What we all do, we try to make sense. So we go like this, and we say, my eyes see a flower, I know a flower, I feel something larger, I don't know what it is. Okay, I will go to the flower, and that is my reality. What I see, the flower. I would argue that artists do not do that. They don't need to do it. They simply stand here and they say, that's a beautiful thing, that's a flower. That's a beautiful thing, which is an inner experience of something larger, and there's no problem with it. That is a contradiction. The artists, I would think, they recognize this contradiction instead of trying to make sense. They don't make sense. They simply accept it. That's one thing, that's another thing, and that's another thing. And it is my observation that this recognition, that is the tool, that is the mystery point. By recognizing contradiction and thing, instead of trying to make sense, I observe that it bursts within the artist. It like flows like a fountain of emotions. It draws into the, and what we're getting is images, words, and senses coming out in a chaotic way. They flow in a chaotic way within the artist. Then we have the process of the 99% hard work, where you have to organize it into boxes. And then the artist has to take the chaotic flow of inspiration and say, fine, this is one box, we call it one word. That, we take that chaotic inspiration, put it here, that's another box. We take that feeling, we put it here, that's a third box. And that linearity is what produces a poem, a coherent poem, or an image. And that is how I observe artists externalize, verbalize what they're doing.